This is the Aware Families Podcast, the show that brings you a science-based, practical look at how to use the principles of functional medicine to keep your family healthy. Welcome to episode 4 of the Aware Families Podcast. This week we're going to be talking about the third pillar of health, which is exercise and physical activity. Again, I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Tom Flass, and I'm here with Brittany Coburn, nurse practitioner and functional medicine expert. And we're going to be talking about just a brief overview on all things exercise and activity and how vitally important they are to our health.
For sure, yeah. One thing we tend to forget about is exercise and movement of our own bodies as we age. But even our kiddos, as we're moving forward in life, seem to be maybe moving less than they were when we were young.
Yeah.
So there's a trend.
Studies show this is an unfortunate trend of downward physical activity. And, we've talked about this many times as we go through our own parenting, real life struggles, that it's often, even though we know how important it is, it's often the first thing to go, but it should be a non-negotiable. Right.
It should be just like we're going to go to bed at night and sleep. We're also going to move our body and exercise in some capacity every day.
And this isn't to be judgy to anybody, but when you look at the data of how unbelievably important it is, not just for physical health, but also for your mental health, and are you able to show up for your kids? Are you going to be around for their high school graduation or, or grandkids, things like that? It's paying your future self. I mean, it's paying your present self, but it's also paying your future self. And we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit later too.
Yeah, for sure. We talk a lot about just, the changes that happen with each of our generations and, what becomes more important or what we think is more important at the time. And so maybe getting back to that place where we recognize how important movement is, and sometimes maybe not even calling it exercise, but just calling it like our way of life. We're not out plowing fields and we're not out digging in gardens all the time, at least everybody.
We're sitting around tickety typing.
Yeah, right? Or
part.
click, play, whatever you do with, video games.
And systematically too, the decrease in the sort of legislated the required amounts of physical education in our kids' schools, and that kind of decline, and that hopefully that's going to be a trend that starts reversing. But the lack of fitness is literally killing us. But both sort of directly and indirectly.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So in this episode we're going to kind of go over what types of exercise are important and why. What are kind of the current recommendations for the type and the duration and frequency of exercise, and what sort of everyday metrics you can use, and some maybe not so everyday metrics you can use to know if you're making progress and sort of where you fall in that sort of fitness zone. Again, just because I think it's, again, because it should be a competitive thing all the time or because it should be a judgy thing, but obviously you want to get yield from your efforts and sort of know, am I decreasing my risk for bad things?
Right.
And,
how is
like
my
that.
heart risk? And the other thing is, other than, noticing how your clothes fit and maybe just noticing that, I feel stronger in my day-to-day life, it is kind of nice to have metrics to follow.
Yeah.
So, and there are some easy ones that we're going to mention today that are, everybody can follow at home probably already. And then there are some that might require, getting out the credit card and
or
shopping a little bit.
Somebody who's well-trained and some of these
sure.
some of these metrics. And some of them can be an eye-opener. Like you may think I'm fine. And then you check some of these things and you realize I've got some work to do, which again, not to scare you or anything, but again, a little bit of motivation.
Knowledge is power.
Yes, knowledge is power.
Yep, for sure.
So why don't we start by going over what are the current exercise recommendations? And I want to make sure we go over both kids and adults because there's some similarities, but there's definitely some differences, especially when we're talking about younger kids.
Oh, for sure. And I think one of the things to just keep in mind too is when kiddos are playing, right? And they're running around, jumping, playing, that can count as movement and activity.
Oh, absolutely.
Exactly. So they don't, sometimes when I'm talking to folks, they think we should be on a regimen as a young kiddo. And it's like, no, you're not really going to be going to a gym, right? But you're playing, you're moving, you're standing, you're squatting, you're crawling, you're running.
Deadlifts starting at 3 years old.
Right? Oh, for sure.
So how about the
Yeah.
young kids, the kids like 3
Yeah.
to 5?
So 3 to 5. So, we were kind of looking up some guidelines to make sure we had, the newest information out here. But the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services publishes a physical activity guidelines for Americans. And this second edition was released in 2018. So obviously a new one is probably coming out shortly. Unfortunately, who knows if the guidelines will go up or down, but
Yeah.
hopefully more.
This gives us something to go off of
Gives us
here.
something to go on. So 3 to 5, we want kiddos active through the whole day. So when they're awake, we kind of want them active. We don't want them laying around watching TV shows and playing video
And just
games.
like kids, you watch them, they do things in fits and spurts, little bursts.
Right. Yep.
They frap, and then they kind of
Yes.
spaz out and
Yep.
get their
and then they
energy
sit
out.
down and,
Yeah.
and color
Which is how
or
it should
play.
be.
Exactly. Yeah. Jumping around, riding their tricycles, riding their bikes when they're, learning how to ride a bike. I don't know how old
Yeah.
your kids were. I think mine
They're pretty young.
4 or 5 for two-wheel bikes maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But making sure that we have, at least 15 minutes every single hour that we're active, like running around as kiddos.
Which I think a lot of places are probably not doing that, but there are both health benefits and certainly behavioral benefits to that, because their bodies know that their bodies want to move, and so I think we should try to be facilitating that.
Well, and like just the focus effort. So right after you can go and do 15 minutes outside in the sun, right, or here in the clouds,
Yeah.
that's fine too. But just being 15 minutes outdoors and then coming back in, they can sit there for a little bit and focus and build a Lego thing or make a fort color.
Yep, absolutely.
The attention that they're able to pay is a lot better.
Yeah, and some of those principles will carry over, but they're a little more official recommendations for their children starting at age 6 up to teenagers, that they have a little bit more sort of official exercise recommendations.
Right. And so when we think age 6, right, so that's kindergarten, first grade. And then when you graduate, 17, 18. So it's kind of that group that we're looking at.
Yep, all through school age.
Yep. And so aerobic activity, we're hoping these kiddos are active at least 1 hour or 60 minutes a day.
Which is weird because it doesn't sound like that much, but then you think about the way a lot of the schools and things are structured, and you're like, for some kids that is a big, they're way off that mark.
Right. So, kiddos arrive at school, they might have 2 or 3 recesses depending, right? 15, 20 minutes each. And then we're hoping there's some playtime after school. But, you get into junior high and high school and they don't really do recess.
Yeah, we'll talk about that, how much that goes down over the course of the school age, how the amount of allotted exercise time decreases markedly.
Right. So in addition to aerobic activity, what else, what are the other things that you've seen that are in the recommendations for that age group?
So things for building muscle, again, not necessarily official weightlifting, although, and we'll talk about this later, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, NSCA, which really trains a lot of the trainers, are making some more guidelines for other resistance type training starting at a younger age than we previously talked about.
Yep.
Obviously not heavy lifting that's going to damage your joints or anything like that. But so anything that could be like climbing, doing the jungle gym, pull-ups, anything, again, where you're getting sort of that muscle resistance, working against body weight kind of stuff is recommended. At least 3 days a week is part of that. And then, the sort of the bone building side of things, which is important throughout the entire time from childhood on, especially as we age. But just, again, any of that weight-bearing activity, running, jumping, some of the other muscle strengthening things are also going to help with the bones. So that should be at least 3 days a week as well. So you really kind of want that combination of and this carries over, the aerobic conditioning for the heart and lungs, as well as the bone and muscle strengthening activities, again, starting pretty young, starting when they're hitting kindergarten. So, and this should be, I think, a structured thing, and hopefully we're going to be really starting to emphasize this more and sort of reprioritizing this in schools, both from the health thing and because of the explosion of pediatric obesity and type 2 diabetes in kids, and as well as the mental health crisis that we're seeing. I think it all plays
for sure. Yeah, for sure. We know running, moving your body, exercise releases happy hormones, right? They've identified the hormones. So we know that this is the case, and why not provide that opportunity during school every day?
Yeah, and make the framework so that the schools can do this, because
Right.
they're kind of getting crunched.
Right. Yeah. Reading, writing, arithmetic,
Yeah.
and not leaving a lot of time for the extracurricular, music, arts, PE,
Yeah.
which I just think are crucial.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing is that junior high school age is a lot of time when the more competitive sports are coming out. And so they might start moving into athletic training activities after school, and even on the weekends. And so some kiddos are getting some really great activity. But again, it's not consistent across the board. It's not just an expectation for everyone. And
we'll talk about the stats in a minute of that. What's the percentage of kids that fall in that category?
Right. I was going to just shout out a few. We had talked earlier today about a few local groups in the area that really work with kiddos. Kelly Mallman with Youth Development, she has some athletic training programs here in the Valley where they will take kiddos and work out in a gym and cater it to either their activities that they're interested in, but make it age specific so that they're really careful about joints and muscles and not injuring, and so protective over those in those capacities.
Yeah.
And then you had mentioned another
over at Logan Fitness, formerly the Summit. There's a bunch of kids activities there, and they have some kind of kids kind of strength and conditioning type of programs that they work with. So I think that's important as well.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so how about adults? What are the adult recommendations?
This one's kind of fun, right? So 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity exercise. So, and we'll dive into what moderate intensity is shortly, but 150 minutes. So that's, to break that down, right? Yep. So what is that? 30 minutes, 5 days a week, or if you are into doing longer exercises, fewer days a week.
Yep.
But how crucial is it that we're getting that aerobic activity in?
Oh yeah, and we're going to talk about the data on that are profound.
Right.
And then I think more recently kind of really started emphasizing the adding, and you got to also have at least a couple days of strength training in there as well, because so many people, and I think more women fell into this category, whether it be cardio, and they were not doing any weightlifting or resistance training, and you really do need both, and we're going to talk about why.
Right. So that was the one thing I was just going to put a little plug in, especially with our perimenopausal, menopausal women, how important weight training is. And so when we have that, when we're struggling with, those extra few pounds that we can't seem to shed, or we have deposits of belly fat, in places around our midsection that we don't want, strength training is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So how far off the mark are we as far as not getting enough exercise and activity?
Yeah, this one's kind of scary, right?
Yeah.
So 21 to 28%, that's well less than 50% of school-age children are meeting the recommendations, and girls are on the lower side of this.
Yep. So unfortunately, that would be based on this, 75% of the kids are not meeting the recommendations of getting the 60 minutes a day, at least the 3 days a week of like kind of cardio and 3 days a week of like kind of strengthening type of activities.
Right. So the interesting thing was we started researching this was PE classes, right? And so how many high schools, and even in the high schools, how many grade levels, right, have to attend PE?
Yeah.
Because it changes.
And it's gone way down.
Yeah.
Way down.
Right. So the percentages now are 26% of high school students attend a PE class 5 days a week.
Which means 75% are less than that, which kind of hinders things.
Oh, for sure. And that's, I know locally, 9th grade students have PE every single day. But what happens when you are, a junior or a senior?
Yep.
If you're not taking an elective class for PE, you don't have one during the day.
And this is nationwide, I think, the trend.
Exactly. And that means
9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, it goes down markedly, the percentage of required
But then they're
time.
choosing an elective, which might impair some of their ability to get into college, right? to do a strength training class. And so it's just, I wish it was just one of those things that we all did.
We don't have a great answer for that, but,
Nope, we
but
don't.
recognizing that there's a problem, I think is the first step.
Yeah.
And then, so there, as far as the actual requirements for phys ed being taught in each grade, so 97% of all schools polled nationwide had a requirement for PE to be taught in sixth grade, but only 43% in 12th grade. So again, that kind of drop off. And they were also trying to, because there's been some recommendations, and again, I think also through that National Strength and Conditioning Association, some other organizations, about really getting more comprehensive programs involved in schools.
Yeah.
But right now it's less than 5% of secondary schools have a really comprehensive activity program in there, because of all the usual players, right? Budgetary constraints, time constraints, things like that. So, we know that it's an issue, and we know, I think, the things that are the secondary result of that with the obesity and the mental health and the pre-diabetes kind of things. But we're, I think, struggling to try to formalize a solution to the problem.
And I think part of it is just acknowledgement and recognition of what it is, right? And so if we are counting on our kiddos having PE at school, we might need to be aware that they're not always getting PE at school.
Absolutely, yep.
And so potentially that means that we do need to shift some time after school hours into structured play, right?
Yep.
And so if you're not on a sports team where you're guaranteed an hour a day or 2 hours a day, because some of those kids are working a long time.
Yeah.
My kiddos have very long practices.
Yeah.
So they're, well above the marks here. But if we're not, I just think it needs to be known.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when they actually tested some of these kids, their fitness levels, and this was in 2012, so I don't know what it would be now. I mean, that's over 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So less than half of 12 to 15-year-olds had what they considered adequate cardiorespiratory fitness, and only half had adequate muscular endurance. So, again, that's not a good report card. And I would wager we're probably worse off now, 12, 13 years later than they were in 2012.
Oh, for sure. Considering our rates of obesity and, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, like you mentioned.
Yep.
I'm
so
sure.
then adult-wise, less than 30% of males and less than 20% of females are actually meeting these recommendations, the fitness recommendations. So not a great report card overall. I think it was according to the Health and Human Services, it was C's and D's all around. I think more D's than C's. So not a good report card.
Oh, well, there's things we can do though.
Yep.
So that's why we're here.
That's why we're yapping.
That's why we're yapping. We can make sure we can bring awareness, because without awareness, there's no motivation to change.
Yep.
So
why is it so important? Good
why?
segue.
Yes. Yeah. Why is it so important? And understanding that exercise is not just about burning calories.
Yeah. That's all you hear about is how many calories did you burn on the ellipse or the treadmill or whatever.
But it might also be that that's one of the metrics you can track because you can see it. And so maybe this little next section where we talk about different things we can track, maybe that will help bring awareness of, hey, there are better metrics to follow for your cardiometabolic
And it's not that
health.
that's not important, but it's really the calories burned while actually doing the exercise, I think, are of moderate to lesser importance versus what it does for your body metabolically and the other 23 hours a day or whatever the other however many days a week kind of thing.
Right.
So,
for sure.
But one of the most profound things, and we were looking at that chart before we started recording, and this was came out through the CDC. There's a chart of what's called all-cause mortality and the risk of dying from any cause, and then they plotted it against how many hours a week of exercise is that person getting. And, starting with 0, and obviously then that's like the highest risk, and just this profound decrease in all-cause mortality.
Like a drop off a cliff.
Like a drop off a cliff when you go from 0 hours to like 2 to 3 hours a week. It's, and then you still get benefits after that, but just even like 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours a week, it's just a profound decrease in all-cause mortality. So it shows you that this is, again, the most powerful drug there is.
Yep. Exercise.
Yeah.
Movement of your body, for sure.
And so obviously you're not maybe thinking in those lines with kids as much, but and this, I'd say anybody in adulthood, that vision should kind of speak volumes to them.
When you hit your 30s. So whatever you do in your body in your 30s
You are
and 40s.
not invincible.
Yeah, you're not invincible, but you also are protecting your 60, 70, 80-year-old body.
Pay your future self.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so put the time in now. It doesn't have to be crazy, which we'll talk about, but even brisk walking every single day is huge. Mm-hmm. So it's not like you have to be
at CrossFit, which is great,
CrossFit,
but
pouring
some people aren't
sweat
into
5
that.
days a week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they also found the biggest predictor of longevity is something called your VO2 max, which is your kind of aerobic fitness capacity, which can actually be tested. There's some more, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, some more official ways of testing this. But even over like diet and all these other things, and obviously not smoking, which is huge.
Right.
But that VO2 max is really correlated with how long you're going to live.
Right.
And I think also how well you're going to live. We talk about that kind of longevity part of it, but also the health span versus lifespan.
Right. Yeah. And being well.
Yes.
Right. So, goals, right? I want to ski with my kids. I want to mountain bike with my kids. I want to hike with my kids. I don't want to be left in the dust.
Yeah.
Right. I don't want to be the one hanging out in the car waiting.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes for when I'm in my 60s and 70s, right?
Yep.
Not just now.
Yeah. So let's talk about mitochondria.
Right. Yeah. So the powerhouse of your cell, exercise directly benefits mitochondrial health.
Yep. Take care of your mitochondria and
Yep.
they'll take care of you. Yeah. So they're the little
Right.
parts in your body and inside your cells that actually create the energy, but they do so much more than that. They actually now know that they are this system of communication throughout your body and that your muscles actually talk to your brain, and the healthier your muscles are, the better your brain works, and those mitochondria, the energy things in your brain, are talking to the energy things in your muscles.
Right.
So you have to think about these things as a whole body unit.
Right. You're not just a system.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not just one piece and one piece and one piece, but you work together as a giant unit.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and the healthier your mitochondria are in your body, in your muscles, in your legs or whatever, the healthier they're going to be everywhere.
Right.
And so it really all, again, it sort of pays it forward.
Right.
And when we talk about the types of training, we'll talk about how that impacts both the number and the function of these mitochondria. But just know that is a huge part of why exercise is so beneficial, is because we're also on the counter side of that, knowing that mitochondrial dysfunction, if you will, is the precursor for so many diseases, whether it's hormone issues, autoimmune
Right.
issues, cognitive decline, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, heart disease, you name it. The mitochondria are at a root cause of a lot of that stuff.
Right.
So,
Which is something we evaluate here in the clinic at Functional Medicine Associates.
functional medicine is wicked all about the
Yep.
mitochondria.
Right. We do a lot of mitochondrial health discussion. Okay, how about muscle mass? So what does muscle mass have to do with exercise? Like, why do we care about your muscle mass?
Yeah, and it's not the vanity part of it, and that's all fine and good. But really, and again, I think especially when we talked about women and muscle, that we're realizing the importance of this, because muscle is metabolism, right? The more, and it's not saying everybody has to bulk up, but having insufficient muscle as we age, which is called sarcopenia, is a risk factor for prediabetes, diabetes, heart disease, but also it relates in with things like the cognitive decline and some of these other, and having more risk of having a fall and breaking a hip and things
bone
like that.
health and balance issues.
Yep.
So we know muscle mass directly impacts your balance. And so when you fall and break a hip, what does everybody think of, right? The downhill slippery slope slide.
Yeah. Yep. And so that whole thing with muscle being metabolism is like, that's where the bulk of your calories are burned when you're at rest. So whether you're burning glucose we'll talk about one part of the proper type of exercise that teaches your mitochondria in your body how to burn fat more efficiently, and while you're at rest, not just while you're exercising.
Right.
And so the more muscle you have on there, that's like, it's like a furnace. You can burn up those other calories, and it's called glucose disposal too, where you have a way to get rid of that glucose so it's not just cruising around your blood causing problems. And so that, again, that muscle mass just really benefits you metabolically.
Right. Yep. Okay, so then we jump into insulin sensitivity. We've been talking about insulin sensitivity, right, with our nutrition, and now here we are in exercise.
Yep.
So, what do you think is the best way to relate insulin sensitivity to exercise and metabolic health?
I think so insulin again is that hormone that's made by your pancreas. It gives the signal to put the glucose, the sugar that you eat, into your cells to either store or burn. And the example of like having no insulin is type 1 diabetes, where the pancreas doesn't work and the blood sugars can get really high and there's no way for that sugar to get in the cells because it needs that insulin. But type 2 diabetes is where the body just sort of isn't listening very well, and then the body has to work harder and harder and harder in order to get that sugar into the cells. And so your pancreas is working double time, pumping out a lot of insulin. And just having too much insulin alone is a risk factor for a whole host of diseases, including cardiovascular disease, but also kind of the pre-diabetes and the visceral fat and all these things. And so the more sensitive you can make your body so that it listens to that insulin better, and the lower amount of insulin your body has to produce to keep the sugar levels down, it's actually better for your entire body. It lowers inflammation. It's better for you metabolically. So sort of training these mitochondria and training your body to burn these fuels makes your body listen to insulin better.
Right. And you mentioned something in there when you were talking about visceral fat. So visceral fat is different for our body, and one of the fats that we don't want. So the fat the fat that's deep inside surrounding your organs. So I talk to people, it's like if you go to pinch the fat in your belly, it's not that fat.
Yeah.
It's the fat you can't pinch.
It's the fat, if you do some imaging, sometimes you can see it like caked around your kidneys and your liver and all your internal organs, which is really tied in with that insulin resistance and increased risk of cardiovascular disease and a whole host of disorders.
Yep.
So.
Exactly. Okay, so then we're talking a little bit about increased fat oxidation, metabolic flexibility.
Yeah, what fuel does your body burn?
Right.
And if you're really unfit, your body just wants to burn sugar, you know, and unfortunately the way a lot of people eat, that's the primary fuel they're kind of giving their body anyway.
Right, yeah.
But the more fit you are, the more ability your body has to burn that fat for energy, whether that's fat that you eat or the fat that's stored. And obviously you like that too, because then you're burning that, you know, you obviously want to have a little bit, but just being able to burn that stored fat so that you're not carrying it around, especially that visceral fat, is a huge benefit of exercise and improved health of the mitochondria and all these things. And so, and metabolic flexibility just means like then your body can kind of shift back and forth between like burning sugar or burning fat. It has that ability to burn both, which is also associated with better fitness, better health metrics.
Right, for sure. You know, and then we even just talk about your vascular tone or your vascular health. So your blood vessels and the flexibility of your blood vessels, right? So people will ask, why does it matter if my blood vessels are flexible versus rigid? You know?
Yeah, and you think of high blood pressure or just overall risk of cardiovascular disease, and that health or not health of the blood vessels are really a large sort of determinant of your risk of getting cardiovascular disease, stroke, you know, all these things that, again, you're not thinking about when you're 20 years old.
No.
But unfortunately, we're seeing, you know, you know a number of people who have had heart attacks in their 40s. And, you know, and so I think, again, emphasizing the fitness piece, but checking the right metrics to find out if you're at risk for something going on is you know, one of the big things that we push and something we do at our clinic here at Functional Medicine Associates. So. Right,
for sure. Okay, so then we can talk about vagal tone, which I actually heard you talking to a patient about this the other day.
So the year of the vagus nerve.
The year of the vagus nerve. There we go. Okay, so I'm pretty sure, if I can remember, you were talking about vagal tone and I don't even remember. Maybe abdominal pain.
Because there's a huge, so the vagus nerve is the huge nerve. Well, it's not necessarily huge, but it's the main nerve that connects your brain with your gut. Right. And so we talk about that brain-gut connection. That's what you're doing. And the vagus nerve is that highway that it's a two-way street communicating from your gut to your brain to your gut. And it also is it's the main carrier. So you sort of have a yin-yang part of your nervous system, right? You have your sympathetic, which is your fight, flight, freeze.
See a bear, run. Or free.
That's your sympathetic nervous system. And then the parasympathetic is your rest and digest. And that vagal tone is basically that balance. It's the main carrier of that parasympathetic tone. And so, and we'll talk about using some of the metrics, but that being able to measure that and improve your vagal tone, improving your parasympathetic, because we're all stressed all the time, you know, crappy sleep, all the whole thing, you know,
Right.
all these different stressors, which
Deadlines.
means our sympathetic stress, you know, fight and flight is on overdrive, and our rest and digest is just getting crowded out. So
Yeah.
exercise directly improves that vagal tone, helps balance that sympathetic, parasympathetic, helps you deal with stress better.
Right. Yeah. And so it's just interesting when you start talking about how that vagal tone, your vagus nerve, impacts, or, you know, how exercise impacts that. So it's just, yeah.
Yep.
Good. Okay. And again, bone density,
Yep,
right?
you are always talking about this.
I always talk about bone density. Yeah. So osteoporosis, osteopenia, you know, you have to have pressure on your bones. You have to be doing something. If you're just sitting, you are losing bone density. You know, at starting very young. So you stop building new bone in your 20s.
What's that? Was it Wall-E, that movie where they're all floating around in the
yep.
chairs? And
Yes, that is actually a terrifying movie.
Yeah.
A little bit.
and their bones are just gelatinous, you know, because they have no weight-bearing anything.
Because they haven't done anything.
Yep.
So this is another reason for, you know, perimenopausal, menopausal women that movement and weight training is so crucial.
Yep.
We're at more risk of osteoporosis than men. It's our genetic makeup. You know, we can go back to estrogen and talk a lot about that. But that big change that happens with our hormones in perimenopause, menopause really is like a stoplight. Like, hey, you've got to make some changes, or, you know, a little trip on a cord or a trip on a corner and you fall and you're going to actually fracture something.
Yeah.
Which is,
But denser
big
bones,
problem.
lower that risk.
Yep, exactly.
Brain health, we kind of talked about this already, that
Yeah.
brain health and mental health link with fitness.
Yeah.
You know, fit body, fit brain,
Right.
and the
When you release
antidepressive
hormones.
effects.
Yeah. You just are you're happier. I know I might be very tired or even unhappy before a workout, but I always feel better after.
Yeah. So that sort of goes without saying, but I mean, it's I don't think it can be overstated, you know, with the mental health crisis going on in America right now. If people took a bunch of the highly processed foods out of their diet and started getting closer, or, you know, meeting these exercise recommendations, what a profound impact that would have.
Oh, it would be huge. Yeah.
And there's no hack for exercise, right? You can't just be like, exercising a pill.
I know.
Because if there were, I mean, obviously somebody
We'd
would
all
be
do
a
it.
gazillionaire, you know? So all the fancy stuff in the world, you know, all the bells and whistles don't stack up even close to the power of exercise. So
you pretty much just have to do it.
Yep.
There's no way out of that one.
So let's talk about the types of training. You know, we'll talk about cardio and strength training, and zone 2. We always talk about the zone. You probably hear about the zone 2. What is zone 2?
Right, especially with zone. Yeah, when you so really fast to back up. So when you look at zones, right, we kind of track 1 through 5. Is that how you do yours?
Yeah.
And so 5 being the most physically active and the
Like
most
maximal exertion.
max, right?
Yep.
Where you can't do it for very long. And zone 1 being kind of life.
Yeah, just walking around.
Right.
Just daily activity.
Yeah. So zone 2 is where we're taking 60 to 70% of our max heart rate. So if you take 220, the number 220, and subtract your age, that will give you about that range.
Roughly predictive of your maximum heart rate.
Yeah. Right. So like a 40-year-old zone 2, roughly 108 to 126 beats per minute.
So this is not hard exercise.
Right. This is talking. Like you and I could talk while we were doing this.
But you should know that, you know, you might be breathing a little bit.
You're going to do that.
But you could have a conversation without passing out.
Right. Or the kind where you're like right?
Yeah.
And you can't,
Can talk while I'm,
right.
You know, it's not like that, but and actually and they call that the RPE, the rate of perceived exertion, which actually is almost as valid as a metric using to know if you're in that zone as looking at your watch or whatever, heart rate monitor kind of thing when you're doing the exercise. Again, you should be able to carry on a conversation, but you know, people would know that you're doing it while you're exercising.
Right.
It's usually in that kind of zone 2.
Zone 2. I've also seen it. So like I have an elliptical that has the iFit on it, and they talk about RPEs. They give a 0 to 10, and they have 10 is your max, right, where you are like our zone 5.
Yep.
And so they'll say, okay, this workout is a 4, our RPE 4 or 5. Right? So you should be able to have communication if someone walks in the room, but you're probably not going to, you know, report on a thesis.
Yeah. And the reason this zone is so important is that they found that we talked about the mitochondria. This is like the mitochondria sweet spot, because it's teaching them how to burn fat. It's stimulating and training those mitochondria without exhausting them, but also you're getting like, I think, like the maximum heart benefits, blood vessel benefits, even though for some people it seems kind of like boring, because and it needs to be prolonged. You can't do 10 minutes of zone 2 and expect, miracle benefits or whatever. But, it's actually, they've talked about this on a number of podcasts. Like Peter Attia had one of the PhD researchers from Colorado who is an exercise physiologist, and they talk about, like, even you're talking about people who are training for Tour de France and all these like high-end athletic events. Like the world's elite athletes spend the vast majority of their time training in this zone. So even though it may be boring, or whatever, it's, they know that this yields the most benefits, and then you kind of stack other exercise on top of it. So, you can read, you can listen to a book, I do a lot of podcasts when I'm doing my zone 2.
Right. Yeah. Well, and then, so zone 3, right, is just a touch above. So heart rate's, 70 to 80% of your max heart rate instead of that 60 to 70%.
And you're still going to get some benefits from the zone 2, maybe not optimal, but if you're kind of, and sometimes I'll sort of float back and forth between them, and then the high end of zone 2, low end of zone 3, and I don't think it's exactly an exact science in that part of it, but you know that you're still going to get a lot of that mitochondrial training, the fat burning teaching for your body, and that's really the area you want to spend the kind of foundational core of your workout.
So like the HIIT training, right? The HIIT training. So that's going to bounce back and forth between a couple zones, right?
Yeah, the zone 2, where you're just kind of at that lower level, and then you're maxing out for however long you can stand, a couple minutes, usually, or maybe even less. Like there's a whole bunch of different interval type of thing. There's different programs out there, but the whole point is like you get a different type of stimulation for your mitochondria and your cardiovascular system, and obviously you need to be fit enough to tolerate.
I was going to say
that.
you gotta gently slow go into that one, right?
Yeah.
Where I think when I started it would be like, okay, 30 seconds of the max, and then
I think
back
there
down.
are additional benefits for like that sort of antidepressant effect and decreasing the risk of cognitive decline, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, things like that. So that high intensity interval training definitely has its place.
Oh, for sure. And then strength training, right? You're building muscle, building bone, more muscle, more mitochondria, more metabolism.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And you need to do, there's classical weight training, there's functional movement, there's all kinds of ways to do that strength training piece.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be just classic, like Olympic training.
And you can do it at home. So, this doesn't have to be like going to a gym.
But one thing I see is like you need to push it a little bit to get the gains, right? You can't just like, put it on the lightest thing, move it, 8 to 10 times, and like I'm good. Like, you need to feel that. You need to feel the burn. You need to feel a little bit of, kind of getting to that point where you're pushing the muscle, because that's how you stimulate it to grow.
Right. And it's interesting because I was talking, I was reading a couple books, which I'll mention here in a few minutes, but talking about, pushing the weight and lifting heavier stuff in fewer reps versus slightly lighter and doing 8 to 12 reps. So that's interesting.
Yeah,
but let's jump into some of these metrics here.
Sure.
Okay, so resting heart rate. So how do you measure if you're in shape or healthy?
Yeah, and there's a bunch of different things. Again, a lot of these you can just do at home, and some of these are really rough and not like you have to fall exactly within these numbers. But in resting heart rate, which is just when you haven't just finished activity, you're just kind of sitting around, fully rested for a while. And obviously it varies over age. Like a baby, their resting heart rate could be 150, and that's totally normal for like a newborn. And then around a year of age, around 100, 80 to 130 can be normal. And then as you get to the more school age, above like that kind of kindergarten, then it should be 70 to 110. And then 10 years and older, resting heart rate generally 60 to 100.
Right.
But trained athletes, because their bodies are so much more efficient, their heart and lungs are more efficient, their resting heart rate can go down into the 40s. And that's, there can be bad heart rate in the 40s, and there could be good heart rate in the 40s, but somebody who's a well-trained athlete. But I would say, if your resting heart rates in the, as you're in your 40s, 50s or whatever, is like 60s and 70s, like that's, I think, a decent average.
Oh, for sure.
And so again, that real rough metric, if you're resting heart rate, and obviously if you're, pounding triple, quadruple lattes, that resting
That
heart rate's probably
caffeine
that's probably going to be a little bit different, but that's
stimulate
a side
that.
story.
Right. Yeah.
So this is I was reading more about
Okay.
this heart rate recovery.
Yeah.
So this, and actually there's some good, interesting data on this, where this is after you kind of hit, and you have to be fit enough to do this sort of test, but if you're kind of hitting whatever your point of like your maximal exertion is,
Right.
and then when you stop and you check and see how far your heart rate drops in that a minute after you stop that exercise, and so say if you were doing whatever, and then you could be like lightly walking around or whatever, but if your heart rate's not dropping by more than 12 beats per minute by that 1 minute of recovery, that actually is a sign that like your heart is not in great shape, and
Right.
that can be going to vagal tone, other things like that, and it correlates with an increased risk of cardiovascular events. So it's like you want a greater than 12 beat per minute drop by 1 minute of recovery, or a greater than 22 beat per minute drop by 2 minutes. Again, something you could easily do on your own at home,
Right.
and I think a lot of the smart
Smartwatches can track that.
and some of these other fitness metrics,
Right.
which is different than heart rate variability.
Right. Heart rate variability, measures the vagal tone, that sympathetic parasympathetic balance, right? And there's all these different factors that are going to play into that.
Yeah.
So
it's not just exercise.
It's not just, your fitness level, but also how well you slept. How much you're caffeinating, right? As I'm pointing to my coffee. What kind of food did you eat?
Yeah.
Were you, like, I was traveling all weekend to a basketball tournament. Those are
If
tough.
you're tracking that, a lot of people, and
noticeable.
alcohol for a lot of people
Alcohol.
really, kills. So
Tobacco.
what the heart rate variability is really quickly is like it measures the sort of the beat to beat variability of your heart rate. So it's different than like your exercise, your zone 2. It's different
Right.
than a resting heart rate. So it's in a more fit heart, I guess, if you have more of that good sort of parasympathetic tone, then you should have more variability between the beats. But if you're all stress, all sympathetic all the time, then you're like, your heart rate's a little bit faster oftentimes, but there's less variability between the beats. And
Right.
so, there's not like a perfect number, because you want to compare you to you, like you kind of track your
Yeah.
own metrics over time. And, it also, like some of the things like the watches are okay, but they're not like the greatest measure in the world.
yeah.
I just picked up this thing called the Morpheus, which is one of those where you wear the belts around your chest, and then it kind of tracks it. But you want to do it usually in the morning before you have caffeine, before you're really doing anything, and you measure at the same time, same way every day. And people use this to track how overtrained they could be, or if they did not sleep well or whatever, so you can kind of use this to see where your sort of sympathetic parasympathetic balance is. Like 50 to 70 is kind of like I think a decent heart rate variability depending on your age. It's higher when you're younger, lower as you age. But people can kind of track this too, and I think as part of this overall, it's not just the cardiovascular fitness part of it, but that is a part of it.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how the more studies come out, we see how important it is that your heart rebounds after exercise,
Yes,
right?
yep.
And so that's kind of where this is showing also.
Yep. That recovery and the heart rate variability.
Huge. Yeah.
We already talked about the VO2 max testing,
Right.
and that's something that can be done at like a fitness center. I know that Logan Fitness here does it.
Yeah.
It's a separate fee, but it's done by a qualified, trained person that really directly measures your cardiovascular fitness. So it can be interesting to do once in a while. Some people are into it, but it's certainly not a requirement.
Right.
And then we were talking before about bioimpedance.
Yeah, right. So those are those different, they're kind of a scale essentially, but it puts electricity through you to measure your fat mass, body water. It also does visceral fat and your weight. I mean, all kinds of things. And you can do a really fancy one, like an in-body one, which again, they do at medical centers and fitness centers often. But they even have some pretty nice ones you can buy, on Amazon. There's one I have at home. I think it was like $50. And it's that Renpho, Renpho, and it's a home scale, and it really, the margin of error is very low.
Okay.
And so it's not a bad option if you're looking at something just to start tracking yourself.
Yeah, compare you to you. Yep.
So I like it because it's a lot, an in-body to purchase for a clinic is, $6,000, right? These other ones are a little more reasonable.
A little bit less. But again, sometimes, you can check at your local gym, see if they have this. And it's a way to kind of, again, measure and track that to see if you're making that kind of progress.
Right.
There's something called a DEXA scan, which is a little more fancy version. You need to go to a place that does
and
x-rays and CTs.
Yeah.
And it uses low-dose x-rays to calculate your body composition, like where are you storing fat, how much fat versus how much muscle.
Which is nice for that visceral fat piece, too.
And I think it's probably the most accurate, but again, there's a cost associated with that. And, some of the, as far as like strength assessments, things like that, it's can be personalized, but definitely if you work with a trainer, there's other fitness assessments that they can do for things like that. Looking at things like bar hang or a wall sit or grip strength is something that's very commonly used. It's very portable and carries over to a lot of other areas of fitness.
Yeah. Flexibility, balance. We already talked about that, right? I use a Bosu ball. I think those are a great thing for home, but super important. It's protective of in so many manners. And then labs. Yeah, right?
I think the labs that we use a lot to kind of see where you're at sort of metabolically, and obviously diet can play in with this, but also your fitness level. So looking at your fasting blood lipids, but really what we look more is your HDL, your quote unquote good cholesterol.
Right.
It's like the thing that's involved with reversed cholesterol transport that brings cholesterol and fats out of your body to your liver to get processed. And having that at a good range, and your triglycerides we probably pay more attention to than the LDL. And with good fitness, you should see a lower fasting triglycerides as part of that. And we can also track the insulin levels in something called a HOMA score, which is a metabolic assessment, homeostatic model for metabolic assessment, something like that.
Right.
But basically it's using your fasting glucose and fasting insulin to see how well you're clearing how hard is your body working to keep your glucose under control.
Right. So again, it kind of plays into that nutrition piece as well.
So I know we'll kind of whip through the last little bit, but making exercise a non-negotiable habit.
Yeah. And there's just so many things that you can do, right? And you start small, make it a manageable change. I was telling you the other day, I started with 8-minute yoga, right? It was like, okay, I had kids. I had like a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have time to do anything, or I felt that way. And then I decided, I can carve out 8 minutes of my life.
Yeah.
And literally that's where I started. And then I would do a 30-day yoga challenge, and then it was a 60-day yoga challenge. And then pretty soon it was like, oh, okay, I can do this.
Yeah.
Right? But you make a habit. You try something at home. It doesn't have to be going to a gym.
Yeah.
You don't even have to have a home gym. I mean, you can have a couple of free weights, and that can be huge, especially for women.
Body weight squats can be tremendous.
I started with body weight everything.
Yeah.
Before I added any hand weights. I don't have crazy fancy equipment. I have some equipment that I use at home in a home gym. And for me, just because we live out in the middle of nowhere, it works better. I know you go to the gym.
Yeah.
If you have a place, set it up. Keep your gym shoes in one spot so hey, that's where I work out.
Yeah.
Have your yoga mat there. Have your weights there. Do something.
And you talked about Atomic Habits, and he mentioned stuff like this.
And that's probably where I got it. So the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, fantastic. Great way to understand why we do things and to understand how you can change, right? So I really recommend that book.
Yep, making things easier for yourself or harder to I guess convince yourself otherwise that you need to do exercise.
Totally. I also, in the beginning, I also got a trainer. And so that really helped me. So she would do, at the time, she doesn't do house calls anymore, but she did house calls where she would come and help you set up a gym. But she now will meet people at the gym, and she does a lot of virtual stuff.
Oh,
so,
cool.
Yeah, Tiffany Riley, she does aesthetic physique training here in the Valley. Instagram, she's at FitTiff777. I think she was fantastic. She helped me for a couple of years before I decided to move on without having a trainer. But Hellroy CrossFit, Logan Fitness. There's so many gyms, right, that have options and have trainers, associated with them, and they teach you how to lift and how to lift correctly. And
I've been really impressed, especially, going to Logan Fitness, like the number of women that are now like really into weightlifting.
It's awesome.
It's really, I think, helping them turn the tide. And there's a lot of the women that teach some of these courses, and the value of it. So,
And it's not just yoga. It's all kinds of stuff, right? Weightlifting, heavy weights, all kinds of stuff.
And then kids, I think, again, bigger picture stuff. We just trying to see what we can do about making sure our schools are offering like regular recesses, exercise break exercise breaks for younger kids,
Right.
trying to really require PE for older kids, and especially if they're not involved in team sports or individual sports like swimming, gymnastics, martial arts, things like that. I
Right.
mean, all those things have tremendous value.
Yeah.
And even just being outside. They talk about a decline in the number of kids that actually spend any time outside. But
Right.
if you're usually outside, you're outside, you're not just going to be sitting there.
Right. You're usually doing something.
You're usually doing something.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
which is for a kid especially super important. Active gaming, again, just a brief mention of this. Like, there are ways for kids who are gamers of doing things, or you can get a good sweat going, so I think using some of the active games, which, aren't necessarily the whole, sit around just with your thumbs exercising.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And then we had talked a lot about, different authors and different podcasters to follow.
Yep.
For women with exercise, if you're in that perimenopause, menopause, I know I've talked a lot about this, but I can't drop it. I think we need to talk more about it to make it more known and more easily talked about, because it always isn't. Dr. Stacy Sims, she's phenomenal. She's a PhD researcher who does exercise. She has 2 books out, Roar, and I can't remember the next one off the top of my head.
One, Gabrielle Lyon.
Gabrielle Lyon, that was my next one, yeah.
Yep.
And then, we've both talked a lot about Dr. Andrew Huberman with Huberman podcast.
Huberman Lab,
The
yep.
Huberman Lab, and then Dr. Peter Attia.
Yep, The Drive.
Yeah.
Definitely get nerdier than we get.
Yeah, they go deep.
But as far as online stuff, sort of the main, governing bodies, so the National Strength and Conditioning Association, NSCA.com, or American College of Sports Medicine, ACSM.org. Really, they're the ones that sort of train the trainers, but they have a lot of good public information out there as well.
Yeah, super awesome. All right, well, we're going to wrap up this podcast. It's been awesome talking about exercise and physical fitness and movement. I always enjoy that. I do want to give a big shout out to our producer, Brandy Burke at tripledivide.creative.com. Could not do it without her. She's been amazing with every single article or every single podcast she's done, has been with us since the beginning. So couldn't be happier. Our next episode is going to be pillar number 4, stress reduction and mental health. We're very much looking forward to speaking about this. Please share these episodes with family and friends. We'd love to grow this podcast. We'd love to see this popping up across the U.S., even though we are up here in our tiny little corner of northwestern Montana. Also, come see us at Functional Medicine Associates. We're open and taking appointments. If you want a more personalized, comprehensive health assessment, you have hormone issues, GI issues, or autoimmune concerns, we're here for you. Thank you for listening.
Thanks.